Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to Why Representation Matters in Food Media. I'm here with George Geo Banks-Weston, and I just want to give a little bit of background. I think I met George about, 7 years ago or so. Yeah, we had a mutual friend, and I think, after seeing each other a few times, we added each other on social media. And I came to realize that George is a food blogger. You have original recipes that you publish. You have gift guides, travel guides, entertainment tips, and a really amazing podcast called Table 86. You have this amazing photography on your social media and also a day job in marketing. So I had to get you on here because you do so many amazing things. So can you provide a brief bio about yourself and your background?
Sure. So I think you covered like 90% of it. You're really, really gracious in that introduction. But as you said, George Banks-Weston, but I go by Geo, and I am a content creator, food and lifestyle content creator based here in Philadelphia. I am at the helm of the blog Geo's Table, and also I host the Table 86 podcast, as you mentioned, where I showcase creatives of color, Black creatives, with a focus on Black creatives in the food and beverage industry. I just premiered season 2 on Tuesday. So with 2 episodes. So I've been doing that since 2019, and I've been blogging since about 2015. And then just the Geo's Table brand kind of started in 2014 via Instagram.
Awesome. So you mentioned that you're a content creator. Can you define what that means? And what it means in the food and beverage industry as well. Sorry.
No, certainly. So content creator is kind of a loaded term now. I think when I look back historically, maybe like 10 years ago, maybe even sooner, when you were a content creator, you probably created one specific type of content, like you were a blogger or you were a podcaster or you were a YouTuber. Now, while one of those things might be your primary mode of content, the content that you create, I think that it has changed. I think it'd be hard to find somebody who's a blogger who isn't on Instagram and Twitter, or somebody who's a podcaster who isn't using other forms of social media. So I think that now the term is kind of a generalist term for somebody who creates all types of content. They might have one major lane, but they create all types of content, specifically digital content in a particular space. So that can be food, that can be travel, that can be history. It just depends. So I think when you think about content creators, first, it's what the content is that they create, which is multiple modes. And then it's the category in which they create that content, which, as you mentioned, food media is my space.
Awesome. So I guess my first question is, what exactly do you define as food media?
Yeah. So food media is large. And when I think about food media, it's because food is either adjacent or involved in pretty much every aspect of life, right? So there might be people who are travel bloggers. Food has a place there. There might be people who blog about politics. Food is political, right? When I think about food media, I think about the mainstream part of that. So Food Network, food shows. But when I think about it at a blogging level, it's food bloggers, recipe creators. With Instagram, I think about how Instagram has been essential to restaurants, and getting out their stories and getting people to come in or just sharing their food. So I think when you think about food media, it is any media that is related to food, but I would say food is the central focus. Whereas with some of these other categories, food is a subcategory of it. I think when I think of food media, it's where food is the central focus, media that relates to that.
Yeah. So how did you get into food media?
I think it's actually funny. I tell people all the time that I grew up in a very like meat and potatoes household. I was not a very adventurous eater. wasn't necessarily picky, but I wasn't an adventurous eater. But I initially got into Instagramming my food because I was new to Philadelphia, new-ish to Philadelphia. I had only been here a couple years, and I moved here in 2010, and I started my feed in about 2014. But it was at a time when Philadelphia was really, I always use this word, blossoming as a food city.
Mm-hmm.
And I was starting to eat out at lots of restaurants, trying new cuisines, and I just naturally, like most people, started photographing it for my Instagram feed. Most people do that. But I have a friend who's a photographer, and he's like, "You actually gotta have an eye for photography. You should like consider changing." At the time, we talked about this. My middle name's Darwin, so my feed was Geo Darwinism, and he was like, "I think you should change it to like Geo's Table," and that's kind of how Geo's Table was born. Um, and then it kind of spiraled from there. I have started blogs in the past that never took off. And so when I saw Instagram had gained some steam for me, that really was like, maybe I'll try a blog this time. And this time it actually worked and took off. So that was kind of my path into starting to write about food, um, outside of just taking pictures of it and eating out.
Sure. So, I mean, when you talk about your interest in food, do you also do a lot of cooking as well, or is it mostly eating out?
It started eating out a lot, and it was very light on the cooking at home, even though I do love to cook and I love to bake. But our current state of affairs, I will say I've created a lot of content cooking at home over the past year, and sharing recipes. And really, my approach to recipes is that a lot of times I take foods of my youth and give what I would say a modern spin on it, just because I am a little more adventurous now and like to try different spices and different ingredients. My husband is also, he's from Jamaica, and he has taught me a lot about Caribbean cuisine. So when you look at my blog, you might see like a soul food recipe with like a Caribbean flair to it. And that's a lot of the influence he has just had on my cooking, and the types of dishes that I make. Because before him, I had never been introduced to a lot of different spices or ingredients.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So I think you do a really great job at social media, and I know that it's really hard for people to sort of brand themselves or differentiate themselves in this saturated world of all this content. So, how were you able to develop your brand?
Yeah, so I will say that I feel like brands are always evolving and should. They should evolve with the times. For me, in particular, not so much when I started the Instagram feed, but when I started the blog, I was really intentional about establishing what my values were. And those values actually haven't changed. It was eat well, share experience, and cultivate community. So whatever I post on my blog, whatever I post on my Instagram feed, I really wanted to align to those pillars. I would say share experience is the anchor. I either want to share my experiences in cultivating community or sharing my experience in eating well. And I think that was a really helpful way to get clear around what my brand is. Um, I also think that imitation is like the best form of flattery, right? Like a lot of people say that. And there are so many people I respected, that I followed and really loved what they did. And I learned so much from it. And I will say what I learned from them, and when you're building a brand, I think is really important, is that consistency and quality go a long way. I think with Instagram, Twitter, even blogging, sometimes we get so focused on that quantitative, more followers, more likes, more things like that. I think those things naturally come when you are more consistent, and you're posting consistently good content, or just posting consistently, and you're focusing on giving quality or giving value to the people who follow you.
Yeah, definitely. That makes sense. Um, what have been one or two of your proudest moments or accomplishments since you started your blog and your podcast?
Yeah, I think about this. When I started, I did not know that I would start getting invited to restaurants or to eat out for free. That was never the goal, right? I just wanted to kind of post my food and share my adventures in eating. So I have gotten partnerships with big brands, and I always think that's like a really good feeling and a really proud moment for me. I recently did a staycation at a Marriott near my hometown. I'm from York, Pennsylvania, but I recently did a staycation at a Marriott in Lancaster. So that was great. Last week I had a partnership with Jack Daniels, and that's great. So when those things come along, I get really excited, and I was like, I couldn't imagine being able to partner with brands like that. I will say for the podcast in particular, I get, and this isn't a pageant answer, but I do get really excited when I see my guest win. Like it's like a really proud moment for me. So when I started the podcast, I really wanted to share the stories of Black, Brown, and other underrepresented creatives. And one of the first guests I had on the show, I think it was episode 3, was Black and Bold Coffee, which is a Black-owned coffee brand. And like shortly after my interview with them, maybe 5 or 6 months later, they got into Target stores, and now they have national distribution. So like, it's things like that. Not that I discovered them by any means, but I came across them when they were still growing their brand, and now to see where they are today, I'm like, yes, like that's really exciting. I get really proud of those moments too.
Yeah, that's great. You know how to spot good talent.
Yeah, I like to think so.
Well, are there any challenges and barriers you yourself have encountered as an underrepresented professional?
Oh, definitely. Definitely. When I think about the challenges, I really think it's probably 2 main things, and they're like 2 sides of the same coin, if you will. The first of which is access to opportunities. I often feel, as it comes to representation, there tends to be less opportunities for Black and underrepresented folks, or not equal opportunities. They're not judged in the same way as others. And so that creates barriers, one, in growing your brand, but 2, in being, profitable as a business, things like that. I think that the other kind of flip side to that is, when I do get opportunities, I often feel like tokenism is another problem that I encounter, where I'm often one of a few in a room. And I think that that's an issue as well. I think that sometimes people, and I'm going to speak specifically about my experience as a Black person, I mean, as a gay person, but specifically as a Black person, I think people sometimes think that being Black is, the Black experience is a monolith. And they want to put that experience into a box and say, this is judging what you have to offer based on stereotypes, or based on about what they believe about your entire community. And I think that's a really big barrier for a lot of underrepresented creatives in really any industry, but specifically in the food and beverage industry.
Yeah. Do you mean that, like, if you get asked to speak, it's always on issues of race and not necessarily on your interests, or, food or whatever, like a chef of color is working on, they're not getting asked the right questions?
Yeah, I think that that's part of it. I think that always focusing on the person of color or the Black person as the voice of equity and inclusion. And I do think that it's important for me to share my experience. And I love talking about it. Like, I love talking about and sharing my experience and hearing other people's experience in the space. I also think that I think a good example of it is, some big brands only see, especially in food, may only see like Black people as soul food bloggers, right? And look at soul food itself. It looks very different depending on where you grew up. I grew up in central Pennsylvania. Soul food to me is much different than somebody who grew up in the deep South or on the West Coast, right? Even if they are Black, our experiences look different. The ingredients we use might look different. And so I think that one of the issues that we often run into, or one of the challenges I've run into, is trying to be placed into that box without looking deeper into what I can offer or what I can bring to the table. Whereas I think that when you think about the majority, they often don't experience those things.
Yeah. How do you feel you've been able to overcome some of these issues in your career?
Yeah. I think that one of the ways in which is having a strong network, um, and a strong network of allies in particular. I think allies who have access to spaces and rooms where you don't sit, but are speaking your name. I actually had a friend just post this on Twitter a while ago, Twitter or Facebook, but said like, who's saying your name when you're not in a room, right? And I've been fortunate to build relationships with some great people who are willing to do that. And I believe that's a role that allies can really play. If you're an ally or an active advocate for Black people, people of color, for underrepresented people, that's a role you can play to actually change the systems that are in place. I also, on the flip side of that, using, I would say, what my little bit of privilege is at times to do the same for other people. So if I get an opportunity come to me that isn't a fit, um, I'm the first person to share another Black blogger or person of color who I think would be a great fit. And I think that's also how we can start overcoming some of those systemic barriers that are in place.
Yeah, and I think anyone who has the space to offer opportunities or programming has to do the same thing. Um, so what does diversity look like in food media today? And have you seen it change recently?
I have certainly seen it change recently. Uh, I've actually seen it going up and down, if you will, like a bell-shaped curve, go from a lot of support to support waning. And what I mean by that is, as we know, we've been in the pandemic for the past year. March is going to be a year, and most people are at home. And over the summer, thinking about some of the horrific things that happened with Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, I think that, and then the peaceful protesting, calling for change, but also the unrest that we saw, you really saw an uptick of people finally saying like, we need to do something. And it was things that, like, I think, I don't want to speak for all like Black and brown people, but I will say for me, and in the conversations I had with my friends in particular, it's things we always knew needed to change that we've been just asking to change. And it finally felt like for a period that people were committed to that change.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, I think that, which again, I think many of us expected, that support, I wouldn't say has diminished, but has gone down quite a bit since that initial summer timeframe.
Yeah.
So, but I do think that there has been positive movement towards change. One thing I can think about, I was just thinking about things that happened over the last year. Like Bon Appetit magazine, they hired a Black woman as editor in chief. I believe her name is Dawn Davis, and
Mhm.
I think she had a wealth of knowledge and experience, and like she could have probably been editor at that magazine 10 years ago, but she wasn't looked at, right? But now people are looking, and we're getting access, a little bit more access to those spaces. And I think that's really important to see those types of changes, especially in the food and beverage space.
Yeah, and talking about Bon Appetit, I know there was a big situation that happened last year. So, I
Hmm.
mean, was that just a direct response of that, or what are your opinions on the whole Bon Appetit situation and how they've had, you know,
Yeah. So from my understanding, from what I remember of the situation, there was the editor in chief at the time, who was a white male. A picture surfaced of him in brown face, and I think it was in the past. I don't know how it was in the past. However, what happened was there was people started coming forward and sharing their stories of racism within that entity, right? That it had been going on for a long time, and that it had been looked over. It had not been addressed. And I think based on what was happening in like current events and current climate, they were forced to do something. And I think that's to what you said. I think that's what happens a lot. Like
yeah.
these behaviors exist. Racism and discrimination is perpetuated in certain environments, but it's not until people are called on the carpet that they want to do something or enact change or offer opportunities to people. And I think that is something that really needs to change. And I think that starts with listening to the experiences of marginalized people, especially in these environments when they say they experience discrimination or racism. um, Listen to them, and act, right? Explore and act. And I think that's how we can start to really change things, not as a reaction, but try to be a little more proactive.
Yeah, and along those lines, I'm sure there was a lot of racism happening behind the scenes, but I know that for so many decades, these publications were writing to basically a white audience.
Hmm.
And I'm kind of wondering how you feel about the appropriation of recipes and different cultures in, these magazines.
Yeah, I think that's a big problem, right? I think that there is enough talent out there from specific cultures and specific backgrounds that should be given opportunity to share their stories, right? And I think we miss the mark completely when we allow other people to share those stories, and to appropriate those stories, right? That to me is another form of discrimination. One thing that I often think about is people don't always see equity and inclusion. They see it as a riskier like strategy, right? They see, I think people are really worried about what if I get it wrong, but I think that it's not necessarily about getting it wrong. I heard this in a training recently, or actually I think it was a podcast I was listening to. It's not about getting it wrong or getting it right. It's about getting better, right? And I think that you can get better when you allow those people to tell their stories, or you bring those people and allow them to have actual space and voice at tables, versus thinking about them as an afterthought or after things go wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, we have a question in the chat from Kerway. Where do you think the line is between appropriation and appreciation?
So, yeah, I think that's a really good question. In thinking about, when I think about appropriation, and a lot of times when I've seen it and I feel that it's blatant, it's taking a dish, um, for lack of a better term, like gentrifying it or renaming it and trying to present it as something else. That to me is appropriation. Appreciation to me is giving credit where credit is due. I would feel much better if we're talking about a recipe in particular, just as an example, if when these things are posted, like on a major site, or that they do the work to get the history, that they talk to people who made the dish, that they not only talk to those people, but involve them in the process and show that they really appreciate their effort. They really appreciate their history. They really want to tell their story. I think that's how we get away from that appropriation piece, and we give credit where credit is due and get into the appreciation of different cultures.
Definitely. So what advice do you have for brands or businesses that want to be more intentional about their equity and inclusion work and strategies?
So I think there's a couple of things. I get asked this question quite a lot, and I think I probably could rattle off strategy after strategy, but I really think here's a good place I think to start. First, whether you're a big brand or a small brand, I think it's important to make sure that your table is diverse, that your employee base is diverse, that they, as I said before, actually have a voice, can actually lead, and that their opinion is actually listened to. Um, I just read in the news yesterday, and I think this is a good example of this, that I think Louis Vuitton had to pull a sweater from the shelves that they created because they said that it was celebrating Jamaica, but the sweater didn't even have the correct Jamaican colors. Mm-hmm. And where I see that as a big issue is it was like, that's a multi-million, maybe $1 billion company, and they didn't have somebody at the table to tell them that those are not the Jamaican colors. They didn't engage somebody from that background or who had that history. And it went to market.
Wow.
And then they had to pull it. So I think that you can mitigate some of those issues that come up if people are at the table and actually have a voice. So I think that's one step if you want to increase your equity and inclusion strategy. Another thing is, I think that we have to look at opportunity as well and the opportunities that are presented. Again, I've said that in the past, I've experienced some tokenism. And I think one way to stop tokenism is, I think certain people have the opportunity to be judged on potential. And I don't think that's always afforded to marginalized or underrepresented people. I don't think that they're judged on potential. And I think that if you really are an ally, you are looking at people and influencers, if you will, influencers, bloggers, writers. You're seeing, are they consistent? Do they do quality work? Let me give them an opportunity, right? I see something in them. And I think that if people really want to increase and drive equity and inclusion, that's another strategy you need to think about, like offering people an opportunity or a chance that you normally wouldn't.
Yeah.
The last strategy I would say is, a lot of times I've heard in the past, it's very difficult to find this type of talent, or I don't know where to go. And I really wish people would change that belief, because I just don't find it to be true. In the age of Google, I don't find it to be true. In the age of social media, I think that it's easy if you put just a little bit of effort into it. So put in that effort to do some research. Ask people around you who they follow, who they believe in, who they think is a quality content creator. And I think that's where you can begin to see some changes in your own strategy.
Yeah. So in Philadelphia, or just the things you're looking at, are there any specific like publications or blogs or lists that you can recommend that are doing a good job at being inclusive?
Yeah, so one of my really good friends is Ernest Owens. He's a journalist, and I believe he did a talk last week for this. He's done a really great job of covering the Black experience, and he actually did a piece specifically in food media a few years ago, which he interviewed me for, Dining While Black. And I think that really talked about the Black food scene, and it may still be on the Philadelphia Magazine website. I think that there are a lot of Black-owned businesses popping up in Philadelphia that you should really be paying attention to. I can think of one I've supported recently was Down North Pizza. They are a pop-up pizza shop. They're located in North Philly, and they're really big on giving back to the community. I think that they're a great to follow. I have on my blog, now all the names are escaping me, but I have on my blog several gift guides and different types of guides that highlight Black-owned businesses and highlight Black-owned creators that I can obviously share as resources that I think would be helpful to folks in Philadelphia and beyond.
Great. So I just want to mention, anyone who's watching this is free to ask any questions. We love to have this be a conversation, or you can type anything in the chat. So I wanted to ask you, can you talk about ways that the pandemic has exposed or amplified the inequities in the restaurant industry, which disproportionately impact BIPOC workers?
Yeah, I think that, and this is from my own experience and my own knowledge, right? I think I know a few months ago, and I was shocked, but there was, I was shocked and I wasn't shocked, but there was an Instagram feed that really started to highlight some of the inequities in pay, some of the discriminatory treatment, and some of the major restaurants in the Philadelphia area. And I think when those things start to surface, I think people really need to make intentional decisions about whether or not they continue to support those businesses, right? Because at the end of the restaurant industry, like many industries, but specifically the restaurant industry, took a really hard hit during COVID, right? But I think that if you value equity and inclusion, if you value equal treatment and fair pay, then you can't continue to support restaurants or companies really more broadly that consistently exhibit those types of behaviors. And I think that in COVID, when we have a industry that's hit really hard, when we have people who are getting laid off, obviously all those things were heightened and brought to the forefront. So when we get back out, when we are able to go to restaurants, when we are able to support, I think it is really important to be intentional about who we support and who we give our money to combat, or it says to me that some of those issues don't matter to you. Really, they don't matter. That's my kind of take on it.
That makes a lot of sense. Are there any, I know you're very well connected in the food industry, so are there any businesses in particular that you've seen make a really great pivot during the pandemic?
Yeah. So in terms of pivoting, I think that a lot of people have moved to online subscription services, pop-ups, meals, things like that. And in terms of the Black community specifically, one of my favorite restaurants in West Philly is Axum Cafe, and they do a lot of takeout. So I love them. There is a Black-owned beer brand which is launching very soon, and I think that they're going to. I think they've already launched, but Two Locals, and they are going to be sold in stores. So I think that they're a great one to support. I mentioned Down North Pizza. There is a soul food vegan restaurant that called Unsoul that I think is another. I'm going to keep saying great one to support, but really go support them. Yeah. So I've seen a lot of that come up. I've also seen restaurants that may not have people of color at the helm, but are placing an intentional focus on equity and inclusion. And you see it in the workers that they hire, in their leadership staff, things like that. One of which I can definitely mention is Triple Bottom Brewery in the Spring Garden neighborhood. They have an intentional, a real intentional focus on being embedded in the community. And that's evident when you walk in there and when you see who works there. So those are just some of the businesses off the top of my head that I would certainly highlight.
Yeah, well, thank you for those. So we just have a couple minutes left. Does anyone have any questions or comments?
I had another question sort of on the theme of trends. Ghost kitchens have been popping up everywhere, if I could say that they're ghosts. And it seems to be a big trend. So not only just pop-up restaurants, but the actual ghost kitchens and providing delivery and that sort of thing. And some of the things that are happening at Bach, that's amazing, giving exposure to people with very specific cuisines. And so I'm curious to your opinion if this is going to be a trend that's going to keep going past the pandemic. And if so, how is that going to impact sort of food media? Because a lot of what is covered is sort of the service aspect of it too, which is not necessarily part of the actual restaurant or chef or whatever. So curious to see what your thoughts on.
Yeah, I actually think I love the concept of ghost kitchens. And actually reminded me one, Fudena, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, I'll fully admit, Fudena is a pop-up that's a ghost kitchen out of it's off of Washington Avenue, but it's great and it's African cuisine. But I do think that that's going to be a strategy in the future, at least for the near future, to have many more ghost kitchens and communities rallying around supporting businesses that are operating out of the same space and spot. I know that service is a big part of the restaurant industry. And I do think that eventually we will be back out and eating in restaurants and we're going to go back to talking about service. But for the near future, and I would say even the next 2 years, I think we are going to see more and more pop-up restaurants. I also think it's almost bigger than just a restaurant industry. I think how we work is changing, how we live is changing. And as a result of that, I think that ghost kitchens and things of that nature are going to be much more popular moving forward. People are going to be at home more if they're not going into the office. People are getting a lot more things delivered to them, and I don't think that that's going to change anytime soon.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, George. So speaking of African cuisine, I'm actually launching a West African inspired banana bread baking mix. It was passed down from generations to generations, and it's an ancient delicacy. And my mom and I would make it for special birthdays, and I decided to produce it in a baking mix so people could enjoy it in the comfort of their home. So I'm actually the founder of Sauces Mix. I can actually put my website in here. But my question was, from your like feedback, are trends still steering to African cuisine or baking at home? Because and my branding is West African inspired food, so I just want to present that with this first. Mm-hmm.
Definitely. I say that to actually just today, I participated in a healthy African food week. I developed a recipe for it. And I'm seeing a lot of that on Instagram and on social media. There's a push to really any culture, but more authentic cultural based cuisine with people from that culture at the helm, right? Okay. And so I definitely think that's staying. Like, I think it's going to continue to be popular. What I think is great about what you're doing in particular is a lot of people do and are for the near future going to be cooking at home, right? And I've seen a lot of a friend of mine, Jay, she actually released a brunch box where people can like make and cook brunch at home. So I think that your product is right on trend with a lot of other things that I'm seeing. So I think it's a great idea.
Okay.
I can't wait to try it. I see your website here.
Yeah, for sure. Please do. And then my other question was, in terms of branding or promotion, are there any platforms that would love to cover my story? About like the story of the origin of it, and then also my story too, because I'm actually a 21-year-old and I'm just starting this out. So I wanted to see people who would like to hear my story.
Yeah, so I think that there's a few. I think that you want to check out, and I can send you a few after this. I have your name here, but Cuisine Noir is a really popular. Soul Foodie is a website that covers a lot of Black stories and backgrounds, and they promote a lot of up and coming Black owned businesses. There is a podcast called Pro Food Maker. Her name is Mercedes, and she is all about Black food entrepreneurs specifically. So I'm sure that she would want to talk to you or tell your story, or even some of these people are great because they even just an introductory or set up a call to talk to them. They are really open to helping. So
sounds great.
I think those are great.
Okay, thank you so much for your help. I really appreciate it.
Oh, anytime.
We have a question in the chat for you. Nakia, your website looks great. Where are you distributing?
Sure, so I'm currently starting out e-commerce, and we're going to be launching March 8th. So if you sign up on our email list, you will get an update on when we launch. And then we're also planning to do some retailers after that, but we're going to start e-commerce because we know that's booming right now.
Awesome. All right. Do we have any more questions? I have one last question for you, George. You have this really amazing podcast where you interview some great, talented people in the food industry. You mentioned you were starting season 2. Can you talk about what your plans are and who you might be featuring in the future?
Yeah, so thanks for asking. So I launched season 2 on this past Tuesday with 2 episodes. And this season, I am really, really excited. I've already recorded about 10 episodes. And there's some people that you might follow on Instagram who are on this season. The gentleman behind Black Food Fridays, who highlights Black restaurants pretty much every day, but also has really used social media to talk about Black food history specifically, and little tidbits of information. So if you don't follow him, he's fantastic. Another individual that I interviewed her podcast is the Food Truck Scholar, and she travels around and interviews Black-owned food trucks. But in the episode, we talked about the history of Black food trucks specifically and Black food vendors. So that was great. And then the first two episodes, I featured a woman out of Atlanta of African descent who used to do, prior to COVID, a dinner pop-up where she would do like a cultural dinner pop-up every couple months. That was really cool to expose people to different types of food around the world and across the African diaspora. And then I had a food blogger, Dash of Jazz, who does food and lifestyle. And so far, I've just been really excited about this season. You can follow me at Table 86. Wherever you stream your favorite podcast, Apple, Spotify, it's just Table 86.
Awesome. And you can also follow George at geostable.com, right?
geostable.phl.com, PHL for Philly, but Geo's Table on social media, Instagram specifically.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being with us tonight. This was a really great conversation, and we hope to have you back sometime. So
thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Of course. Have a good night.
You too.